Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. And we know, as always, we have international visitors on our infrastructure intelligence events. And welcome to this morning's roundtable on infrastructure investment and levelling up the north-south divide. And I'm really pleased that we've got such an excellent panel to discuss the issues this morning, who I will introduce in good time. I want to particularly thank our two elected mayors who are on the roundtable this morning, which we're organising in association with BECG, our strategic partner. I know it's extremely busy at the present time for both Steve and Andy, and indeed everyone on the call, because of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. And we're really grateful for people to take time out today to explore these issues and to add some insights. Just a quick word on format. Our panel will say speak for a few minutes just to set the scene as they see it from their perspective, and then we'll move into a roundtable discussion, which I will chair. If you do have any questions, then please put them in the chat, and I'll try and get to them as we move on. We won't be able to get to every question because we'll just have too many, and we won't have enough time. But nevertheless, we'll do our level best to try and cover the issues that are raised in the questions. As I said, today's roundtable is on the role of infrastructure investment and levelling up the north-south divide. We saw, didn't we, recently, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson talk about build, 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 and the importance of construction and infrastructure in not just revitalising the economy, but also in his words, levelling up those areas that have suffered over, well, it's fair to say, many, many decades, especially around the north. And there's no question that infrastructure investment in particular will have a key role to play in revitalising the economies of the UK, but particularly the north, which is obviously what we're concerned with today's round table. I want to introduce, first of all, Steve Rotheram, who is the elected Metro Mayor for Liverpool City Region. He took on that role in 2017. He was previously the MP for Liverpool Walton from 2010 to 2017, and he was born in Liverpool, and he left school to become a bricklayer. So he does know a little bit about our sector, and he set up his own company at the age of 22 as well. So anyway, without further ado, I'll bring in Steve to make a few introductory remarks. Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Hopefully people can hear, because obviously there's always the fear of technical problems. Thanks very much for the invite. And you just mentioned it about, the Prime Minister's spoken about levelling up, and myself and Andy Burnham have met with the Prime Minister, and we've tried to explain to him just how important infrastructure is in that levelling up agenda. And look, the likes of the NIC, we've had conversations with them, and we're part of TFN, which is Transport for the North, because we believe that infrastructure across the whole of the country needs to be improved. So, west, east, as well as north, south. And infrastructure was massively important to us pre-pandemic, but further investment now is necessary because COVID has changed everything for us. And obviously the need to level up the country has never been more urgent in our history, as the North appears not only to be left behind at times and receives a lower share of income from government for infrastructure, but also we look to have been disproportionately hit by COVID. And although many of us expect that the South will catch up at some time, at this moment in time, we are really, really going through a terrible moment in our history, with exponential increases right the way across the Northwest. So pre-pandemic, we had a detailed plan to share with government to look towards investment opportunities in the Liverpool City Region. And before all this kicked off, we were the fastest growing city region in the whole country, and we had advanced proposals for huge schemes. For instance, on our transport system, we wanted a London-style integrated transport system, buying our own £500 million worth of rolling stock, brand new trains, but developing options to link them with our bus network around re-regulation. And we've got an emerging option of franchising for our buses, and that alongside an extensive travel, active travel network, you know, for our walking and cycling. We've got 600 kilometres in our plan. All of that alongside some of the other things that we would do, and that changes the fabric of how we can improve our fortunes in the future, such as the fastest broadband speeds in the whole country, and really ambitious plans to maximise the opportunities of tidal power. You know, we have one of the largest tidal ranges in the whole country, nearly 11 metres between ebb and flow in the Liverpool City Region with the River Mersey. And so we're looking at a point along that river to see whether it would be appropriate for either a barrage or a lagoon. But that's what we want to do. It'll generate enough energy for 1 million homes for 120 years. So that's a huge infrastructure project that I think everybody would sign up to. And that means that we can take advantage of the green industrial revolution, and not just with tidal, but of course we've got Europe's largest offshore wind cluster at Barebow Bank, and we've got the facility to capture and store hydrogen in the city region, huge amounts of hydrogen, and we're already seeing what those uses can be, with Alstom developing hydrogen cell trains for the whole network. We're looking at hydrogen buses in the Liverpool City Region to supplement our fleet, and we'll procure 20 of those by the end of the year. And then we're looking at hydrogen being used in the supply to domestic properties, but also in something called Glass Futures, which is about energy intensive industries using hydrogen. But it needs a network, of course, and that means that we need additional infrastructure investments, and that, of course, has to be in partnership with central government, and we're trying to whet their appetite really to do some of these big schemes. So we've developed a comprehensive economic plan with them, and it's called Building Back Better. Now, myself and Andy have been speaking for some considerable time about Build Back Better. So our plan, Building Back Better, really does encapsulate all of the things that we want to see, and that includes things like digital connectivity, which you mentioned, but repurposing roads and highways for more active travel. It's about housing and logistics. It's about our huge ambitions in regard to the fourth industrial revolution. It is about using brownfield sites first, for instance, but a whole host of different things. It's not a begging bowl that we're providing for or presenting to government. It's an opportunity for genuine investment that gives the government a return for UK PLC. And I think that's the way in which that we can all move forward and you can genuinely get levelling up. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks for that, Steve. Some really interesting points there, particularly transport, I think, which is obviously going to be crucial going forward, not just from the point of view of connectivity, but also from the reduction of carbon, which I think is a really important issue going forward, and one that many people say post-COVID is even more important for society to grapple with. Just coincidentally, we've got a webinar on that very issue next Friday, but that's another issue for next Friday. Anyway, thanks for that, Steve. No doubt we'll explore some of those issues in the discussion. Next up, we've got Andy Burnham, who is the elected mayor for Greater Manchester. Andy was a member of Parliament for Lee in the Northwest from 2001 to 2017. He was also a member of Gordon Brown's cabinet as Chief Secretary of the Treasury from 2007 to 2008, if you can remember that far back. And he was also in the cabinet as Culture Secretary in the late 2008, 2009, and he was also Health Secretary. So he knows how government actually works. He became Mayor of Greater Manchester since 2017 and famously said when he was elected that he moved back to the north, or wanted to be more involved in the decision-making process of the north and the great cities of the north. And you could argue that given what's happened in the recent period, devolution and major cities in the north making decisions for themselves has become even more important. So maybe Andy was quite prescient, and Steve for that matter, in doing what they did a couple of years ago. But anyway, over to you, Andy, for your initial thoughts on this issue.
Well, thanks, Andy. Morning, everyone. It's great to follow Steve, and I'm glad you're going to hear from Jesse later from the Northeast, because I think all three of us are kind of engaged in a change project for politics, really, in this country. You know, changing the way the whole system works. Steve and I sat down in a pub in Westminster. It was like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown when they went to that restaurant and did that deal. Well, we did something similar. We went for a drink one day after a bad day in the Commons and said, you know what, are we ready to leave here and go and try and build devolution in the Northwest? And we kind of agreed to do it together. So, you know, you've just reminded me about that. Why? Well, we had a lot of experiences in Westminster together, working on the Hillsborough campaign, other things. But we'd just come to the conclusion that basically, let's get this straight. Westminster's created the North-South divide in this country by not investing in the North over generations, you know, under all governments. It's the London-centric country. And, you know, before we talk about all the things we want to see, you've got to recognise that the processes of the country disadvantage the North. The Green Book doesn't favour infrastructure projects in the North. The Barnett formula, in my view, doesn't treat the North well. So, you know, we came out of that Westminster world to challenge it from the outside, and I think we're beginning to make some inroads. To get to the kind of heart of this, and Steve touched on it, you know, the theme of this is levelling up the North-South divide. You know, let's have it right before we get anywhere. We're being levelled down at the moment because we're under restrictions. We aren't getting the financial support. We've been under them for weeks. Steve's now coming under them. COVID is ruthlessly exposing the inequalities within the country. And it's interesting, actually, if you go back to the point where Greater Manchester was put under restrictions in the summer, in late July, it was ourselves, East Lancashire, and parts of West Yorkshire, the sort of Bradford, Kirklees side of West Yorkshire. That footprint was almost exactly the footprint that the Labour government had for housing pathfinder schemes. And I think what that says to you is that, you know, there have been many promises to level up the country that have never come good. And it's those places that have never had the investment that have been most exposed to COVID because of poor quality housing, where people can't isolate properly, is one reason. But let's also remember that it's the nature of people's work in large parts of the North that means they're more at risk because of the nature of the profession, the lack of pay and security to help them self-isolate. So, you know, it's a challenging kind of climate in which to have this discussion. And the first substantial point I would want to make is that levelling up as a concept needs to be redefined now to recognise this new reality that we're in. So it began as a thing that was all about, you know, the usual high-vis, hard hats, very glamorous projects, high-profile, HS2, Northern Powerhouse Rail. You know, we know all the things, don't we? And it was all about R&D. That was never going to level up the North. On their own, those things might help, and we want them, don't get me wrong, but you can't rest levelling up on that. You know, a train line that might arrive in Liverpool and Manchester in 2035, or you know, that doesn't level up in any meaningful way for people who live here. So it's got to be redefined, and I would say it's got to be redefined with regard to the basics that have not been there to promote and protect people's health in this pandemic. So let's start with homes, good homes. You know, we need infrastructure funding to support the building of modern, zero carbon, affordable housing across the north of England. So, you know, we need changes to that Green Book to allow the release of brownfield funding to unlock the many sites that we have across both Tees Valley, Liverpool City Region, Greater Manchester, that have that industrial past, are hard to regenerate because of the cost of cleaning it up. That is funding that needs to be released so that we can build those affordable homes that people currently don't have. And for me, that is the first part of levelling up. Levelling up's got to be about people, not infrastructure, actually. And I know that's not the title of your organisation, but it does. You have to start with people and what do people need, and then you think of the infrastructure that follows that. So, homes build health, and we have too many homes in this country at the moment that don't build good health, and that really needs to change. The next is obviously good jobs and good opportunities. So Steve and I are both working on we call it a good employment charter. It's a fair employment charter in Liverpool City Region, but it's the same thing essentially, to try and give people obviously a living wage, but more security in their work. Steve mentioned good connectivity. I hope others have sort of had this reflection during this period. It never ceases to sort of escape my notice that certain people can have conferences like this via digital means, but others are not in the conversation because of lack of connectivity in terms of affording the kit in the home, or actually the broadband that they have. So digital infrastructure, I think, takes on a new significance coming out of COVID. And we have plans in Greater Manchester for full fibre to between 25% and 40% of our neighbourhoods, but it should be 100%, and it should be 100% across the Tees and the Liverpool area as well. And then you come to transport. I absolutely agree with Steve about London-style transport. That is what would make levelling up meaningful for people here. And what I mean by that is, a modern zero emissions integrated system where people could take as many buses, as many trams as they like in any given day, but it's all within a cap, and therefore it makes it preferable to the car. Sadly, the car is still king in large parts of the north of England because of the cost of public transport. A single bus ticket in our regions can cost £4, even more. It's £1.50 in London. Until there's parity on the cost of simple everyday travel, levelling up will be a kind of a phrase that won't mean anything to the vast majority of the people who live in our region. So transport, I think, has got to change dramatically in the north. We are going out to consultation on a clean air zone for Greater Manchester next week. All 10 boroughs, it'll be the biggest in the country. And I think that's got to become a catalyst for changing public transport at the same time, seeing that switch to cleaner, better, reliable vehicles that can both improve air quality, but also the experience of the public when travelling around. Andy, I'll then finish on a slightly more positive, but kind of bigger picture point, and Steve touched on it. I think for us, it has to be a green recovery, because there's real potential to create jobs here in the north coming out of this. We've got a date of 2038 for carbon neutrality in Greater Manchester. And I think that can really help focus recovery in the right way coming out of this, because we know we're going to have to retrofit our buildings, and we know we're going to have to change planning to create zero carbon buildings rather than adding to the problem. Let's get on with this now, because there are big numbers of jobs in that area, in building that type of infrastructure, that will require knock-on changes in further education, apprenticeships. So we need to get on with that now. That's infrastructure intelligence, to use the title of your where you kind of see what's coming and then you prepare for it by going back into the training system and recognizing that these are jobs that people, good quality jobs that will be there for a good number of years. And that's something I think we should get on and do. I think we should get on and build a new generation of zero carbon homes for social rent across the north. And I've been discussing with Electricity Northwest and Cadent, picking up on some of the energy schemes Steve was touching on. I've been told by them that with the right government backing, they can hit 2038. And they're talking to us about a full partnership to achieve that. And that would put, I think, the UK in a good light as we move towards the COP meeting in Glasgow next year, where the UK is going to be in the global spotlight. Surely this is a moment for the government to say, right, you know, with Steve's ambitions around tidal energy, our ambitions around 2038, let's get British cities in the spotlight at the COP meeting in Glasgow next year, with really credible and exciting plans to rethink the infrastructure of our cities, but deliver thousands of high quality jobs in the process. It's there for us if the government is prepared to work with us to redefine levelling up and give it, as I say, a more everyday people focus. Because you know, if we hit 2038, it will mean reducing people's energy bills, giving them better homes to live in, and actually, Andy, it would make the country more resilient were we, God forbid, to face another pandemic later down the line.
Thanks very much for that, Andy, and for reminding people as well that levelling up, although it is a bit of a sort of a loaded term and has been used quite a lot by the current government, you know, if we're truly going to achieve that, then we have to address the wider issues. And as someone who previously worked for a health and wellbeing campaign organisation in the Northwest around health inequalities, I'm only too aware of some of the deep-seated structural issues that need addressing. The infrastructure can actually play a key role in doing that, but we have to understand the final output and the final outcome of that work. And that's why I think things like social value are really critical, and something that this sector needs to talk about a whole lot more than it already does. And really good to see that concentration as well on net zero. And I think we do have a fantastic opportunity with COP next year, and it should be a showcase for what the cities and towns in the UK are actually doing. And let's hope that, you know, that will actually happen going forward. But thanks for that for now, Andy, for your thoughts. Our next speaker is someone who is a candidate for the Labour Party candidate for Tees Valley Mayor next time round, and that's Jessie Jo Jacobs. And actually, somewhat surprisingly, some would say disgracefully, she would be the first female mayor in the UK if she wins next time. Obviously, she should have had an election this year, but obviously COVID-19 put pay to that. Jessie has a background in community work. She set up the charity A Way Out in Stockton for vulnerable women and young people. And she's said and gone on record that she intends to focus on jobs and transport as two of her key policy areas if elected as Tees Valley Mayor. And she also has highlighted the climate crisis as a key part of her plan for transforming the Tees Valley. So over to you, Jessie.
Thanks, Andy. It's great to be here, and I've often found myself in spaces where actually there are many more males than females. From being a surfer in my spare time to being obsessive about trains. And actually, I was passionate about seeing the role of mayors develop before they were even in existence. When we got the London mayor, I always felt like the North East needed a voice to champion and set vision for places. And I want to talk a little bit about that, really. I won't Andy and Steve have already highlighted some really important things that we can be doing with devolution. But just to take a step back and think about what does it mean in practice. And actually, I spent a little bit of time with Andy when I was looking into standing to be the candidate for mayor. And what I found when I spent a time with him was that Andy runs Manchester like he's running the country, but the people are connected and close to him. And that's the real power of devolution and having local leaders, because you can put decision making in the hands of someone who is connected enough to their communities and their local authorities to really understand what it will take to get places moving, to get places thriving, and to see that bigger picture. And I was really inspired by that, and I've got a vision for the Tees Valley, and But I want to share some of the challenges in that, because my vision it's simple. It's that we're a great place to live, work and play that puts the well-being of people and the planet at the heart of economic development, and to see those things that Andy mentioned from Manchester, to see the things here, zero carbon homes, cycleways, a great transport system that is connected, transport infrastructure of the future, not the past. We still have railways that aren't electrified, and I set out my campaign saying I want the Tees Valley to be the place of the first hydrogen train. We were the place of the first passenger railway. Why shouldn't that innovation come to us now? But at the same time, if we want hydrogen, then we have to have green hydrogen, which means we have to have significant capacity within our renewables. We don't have that at the moment. And if I want zero carbon homes and the retrofitting, that means retrofitting, and that means that all the future housing that's built has to be built around zero carbon, fast broadband, community well-being through having. We've moved much more local during COVID, and I think that was already happening anyway. The trend was neighbourhoods in places like I live, as opposed to cities and city centres. But actually the infrastructure is not there at a neighbourhood level because things are very, very centralised. So that's my vision for the future, but the restrictions and hearing like Andy and Steve with these brilliant plans for their places, but they're still having to sell those plans to the Treasury. They're still having to make the case for, we just need this money to come here and we just need this project. And at some point, I don't want to have to go with a begging bowl to Treasury. I want the money to already be in the north. I want significant funds to be in the north so that we've got the funds there for radical and massively kind of ambitious green energy projects. I want the money to be in the north for transport projects. Like, if we talk about levelling up, I don't want to have to bow the head to Whitehall and then give them a big hug when they finally decide that my project's the one that that's going to be funded. It's not good enough. And it's not good enough for the people that I'm seeking to represent. So that's some of the things that need to be done. As well as that is, like we mentioned about the Green Book, but having a social return on investment has to be a priority. Regional funds, even when they followed need, were massively bureaucratic, already subscribed how they should be spent and what they should be spent on, just sometimes to the pound. We can't have that. We have to have real local decision making and real regional decision making, and that's how we're going to see, in my opinion, levelling up, and that's how we're going to enable the mayors of the future to set a vision for their places and to achieve that.
Thanks very much, Jessie, for that. Some commonalities there between what you said, what Steve said, and what Andy said as well. Particularly, again, heartening to hear about net zero and zero carbon, which I think we can't talk about enough, frankly, in this context. Our next panelist is Dr. Henry Kippin, who is the Director of Economic Growth for the North of Tyne Combined Authority. He took on that role last December after working for the West Midlands Combined Authority as Executive Director for Public Service. And when he took on his new role, Henry said, "Now is the time to show how devolution can help shape a different model of inclusive economic growth." So, Henry, it's your chance to say a few words to our audience. Over to you.
Thanks, Andy, and hi, everybody. It might be a little bit more boring coming from me, being as I'm on the official slot. So there's a lot to agree with in what Steve and Andy and Jessie have said, certainly from the perspective of us in the North of Tyne. We're actually a cross-party combined authority, quite small in terms of the number of authorities, but quite big in terms of the geography. And we've got an urban and rural and coastal mix, which makes our infrastructure requirements and the vision for the future slightly more nuanced and diverse than certainly it was in my previous gig in the West Midlands. I'm not going to repeat what anybody said, but I want to emphasize 3 points really that are important to us. The first is a point around scale. So we've all put in our recovery plans, as the mayors have said. Those are recovery plans that relate to a short-term set of adaptations around COVID that are really substantial and continue to be. And we're in extra lockdown measures now. Just looking at the hospitality sector, for example, gives us a sense of the scale of what we're asking people to do. We've also got a really fundamental medium-term adaptation around net zero. We've talked about that, but around population change as well, and changing the way that people are living and working. And we can't take our eye off that ball either. The scale of the inequalities that we are already at the sharp end of in the northeast and the north of Tyne in particular, just give you a sense of what's going to be needed to make levelling up real. And I think there is a bit of a step back. This is more than a list of projects, isn't it? We've all said that, but it has to be, and devolution has to be about pushing for more than that. Second, I think is a point about devolution, and again, this has been touched on, but to me, and certainly if you look at our programme, when we talk about future infrastructure, that has to be physical, social, and digital infrastructure together. The whole point of devolution is that you're able to bring together levers for change across those areas. And actually, some of the work that's been done in GM by the panel that the mayors convened with Mariana Mazzucato and others, that was reported in the paper a couple of weeks ago, making very similar points at a very practical level. When we're thinking about who's going to invest in the north of Tyne post-COVID, it's the links between our health assets and our economy. It's that physical digital mix. It's that urban rural mix and a breathable city. All of those things feel slightly different now. And if we can't act in a way that brings together the levers for change across public services through to infrastructure and transport, then it's very hard for us to adapt to that. So I think that's a general point, but it is absolutely specific to the north of Tyne in terms of our journey. And then the lastly, I would say, just chewing on this question of infrastructure and infrastructure improvement, and probably taking the intelligence word that Andy focused on. How do we do this intelligently? There's definitely gains to be made, and we're grateful for resource to support short-term building. We absolutely have infrastructure improvements, but the question of why you're doing it is so fundamental, isn't it? And a great example for us in the north of Tyne is we have a beaching line. We're hoping for a positive signal from government over the next couple of months to reawaken an old passenger line from Blythe to Newcastle, which, depending on your point of view of what this means, is either a great rail engineering project that can be done quickly and can shift a bunch of people from one place to another, or it's about fundamentally connecting places and the industries within them and helping that shift towards net zero, given the offshore wind component up in Blythe for us that's so important. So I think there's a question for us in how we take what we've got at the moment, which is real enthusiasm around the building agenda, around some of those short-term initiatives we know we're going to need, around renewal of our urban places, but remembering that devolution is about bringing that together with an aspiration for social life and public services within a place over the long term. And that's what we're about in the north of Tyne, I would say. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks very much, Henry. I want to bring in Debbie Francis now, who is the city executive for the North for the consultancy firm Arcadis. She also represents Arcadis on the board of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, who, interestingly enough, last week produced a new paper talking about the North taking control of building back better. Debbie's got quite a lot of experience in working in the infrastructure sector, obviously on the ground. What are your thoughts and reflections on what you've heard so far, Debbie, in relation to some of the I suppose the logistics of all of this, of making it happen and making sure that actually the investment goes into the right place? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So yeah, listening to Andy and Steve and Jesse, as a northerner too, who's really, really keen on the devolution agenda and infrastructure and the part it plays in levelling up, I can't disagree with anything that they'd said there. And I think that it's the thing is, it is for me, it's a circular thing. So Andy focused really heavily there on housing, for example. I totally agree. But because that does lead to well-being, but infrastructure investment is one of the things that leads to the jobs and the skills, which leads to the education. But you can't actually have one without the other, because if people don't have the environment that allows them to have the right health and well-being and to learn, then we're not going to be able to create the right skills and the jobs. So that whole thing is a bit of a circular approach to it. It's absolutely imperative. The headline messages coming out of the work that we've been doing is obviously that stronger and more wealthy communities have got to be at the heart of the plan. And for me, devolution is very, very much at the heart of that. You know, at the moment, for example, on the housing front, I think it's only Greater Manchester that's got any benefit from that so far. And we've got to look at the whole of the north in terms of that housing issue that we've got. And, you know, some of the funding has been given, but not all of it. Why? You know, we've got some of the skills funding, but we don't have all of it. Why? The only people who are close enough to actually make the right decisions for us in the north is the north. It is those combined authorities working together in some instances as well, so that we remember that it isn't only about Manchester, or it isn't only about Leeds. We have to look at Sheffield, we have to look at Cumbria, and we've got to involve all of the key areas across the north in this, which the combined authorities collectively can also do. So I don't know why the government are handing out, you know, bits of the money but not all of the money. I think it's got to all come, and that we are placed to actually make those decisions best, and to look at what it will take to rebuild our own communities, and what is imperative for us. So for me, it's absolutely essential that both infrastructure and housing, Andy, go together, and because they lead to what we need here in the north. The other thing I keep saying as well, that levelling up, you know, it's not a competition. We're not taking it away from the south. It isn't something they're going to lose because we got. It's not a competition in that sense. It's just that we need to be allowed to get the funding that we need to bring ourselves up in the north.
Thanks, Debbie. I mean, it's not a competition. I mean, but you could argue that it's actually a justice issue or a social justice issue as well, because if you look at London, and I'm sure Marcus will talk about this when he talks in a second, that, you know, London gets 3 times the spending on transport than the whole of the north. Now, I know London's a bigger area, but the north's massive, you know, as we can see from the people around this virtual table, and that can't be right, really, and needs correcting. I mean, Marcus, I know you know, the IPPR North have done some excellent work in relation to, you know, surfacing some of these issues. You know, some brief comments from you on that, and also whether or not we've actually got proper devolution for this region, and whether or not people like Steve and Andy have got the wherewithal and the clout to take the decisions that they need to take to make a difference. Marcus.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, so in terms of, I suppose, the north-south divide, I think maybe we'd take a slightly different view over time, that actually, whilst, you know, that you look at spending on a north-south level, you do see these clear differences. The system doesn't work for anybody. You know, the parts of London have really high levels of poverty, really high housing costs. The southwest is really poorly served by transport infrastructure and has really high levels of deprivation in pockets. And that comes from a very London-centred view of investment and the way we deliver transport infrastructure. The system doesn't work. And so, yeah, so to start with, I'd just say we think that the north-south divide is maybe a bit of a simplistic picture, and there's a much richer picture that is actually helpful in, I think, building a coalition for support behind devolution and fairer investment in infrastructure. But as you said, there is a north-south divide in levels of transport spending. So I think it's the decade to 2018, spending per person in London was 2.4 times higher than spending per person in the north. And in our most recent analysis of looking ahead at the government's infrastructure pipeline, that rises to 3 times. So it's getting worse, it's actively getting worse. And this all kind of comes together into the fact that, you know, the UK is one of the most divided countries. It is the most divided comparable country in our view, and that cuts across the big economic measures like productivity, incomes, but it also cuts across measures like health. In all 3 of the northern regions, healthy life expectancy, average healthy life expectancy is lower than the state pension age. You know, 1 in 4 workers in the north are paid less than the real living wage, which rises to 1 in 3 women. This isn't just about GVA, it's about the quality of life, it's about our access to opportunities across the country. And there is a role for transport in that. You know, we've got to improve connectivity at all levels in the north. And I think sometimes when we think about infrastructure, we think about HS3, Northern Powerhouse Rail, whatever it's being called this year. But ultimately, it's about all levels of that. It's about the active travel, walking and cycling stuff that happens in your neighbourhood, with the benefits for your health, with the benefits for air quality. It's about the metroisation of our commuter rail networks to improve that connectivity in our city regions. And yes, it's about intercity transport too. I suppose for us, it's about more than just the money. It's about the power to make those decisions. It's about the power to decide how that money is spent. And it's really positive to hear that, you know, everyone who's spoken so far is really clear on the fact that infrastructure has to be about the whole benefits that come from that, not just economic, environmental, social, but also that it's got to be about devolution. It's got to be about the transfer of powers. And I think it comes back to what Jesse Joe Jacobs said earlier around, you know, the North wants to get away from having to go down to Whitehall and asking for money for Project X and money for Project Y, and these constant rounds of submissions, of competition that just take up all the capacity that we've got in our combined local authorities. We did some research earlier this year. It's sort of all rolled into one, hasn't it? On the impact of 10 years of austerity. And there's a graph in that shows, you know, over the course of austerity, local government capacity and just dropping off a cliff. And at the same time, central government capacity has increased. And our development capacity to develop projects, to decide how we're going to spend the money that we do get allocated, has just been decimated. And so for us, it's, you know, it's institutional capacity. We absolutely need institutional capacity to make decisions. We need the devolution of powers in order to decide how that money is spent. And I think it's quite sweeping, the powers that we need across, you know, rail, simplifying the franchising procedure for the metro mares and buses. And then there is obviously the money. I think for the time being, you know, we're not going to suddenly see the North given its own capital budget. It's something we would like to see, but I don't think that we can do that until we've built on the others, until we've got the institutional capacity to design the projects, to work out what's best for the North, and the decision-making power to decide how that's spent. Because, I mean, the final thing I'll say, I think, from our point of view, is that the centralised governance model that we have in the UK means that we have over-centralised politics, and central government's political decisions just are way too London-centric. And these decisions just favour London at the expense of the North.
Thanks, Marcus. Just want to bring in Kevin Whitmore. Kevin's director, he's the head of North for the communications consultancy BECG, who we're working with on this series of events. Kevin, what's your thoughts on what you've heard? I know you work with a lot of infrastructure clients in terms of you know, helping them get their views across in relation to projects, major projects, in many cases. Your thoughts on what you've heard?
There's been a lot of consistency, hasn't there, from the panel? I think, you know, we're all based in various parts of the North, and we all sort of know what the North needs, and we're all agreed. So I think, you know, part of the problem, part of the solution is making sure that government hears with one voice what we need from the North, from them. I think the points that the 3 points that I want to make really are, you know, the first is undoubtedly, I think the levelling up agenda has taken a hit this year with everything that's going on. You know, we've had delays to the energy white paper and some of the stuff that we were hoping might come out of that in terms of the hydrogen and carbon capture agenda that Steve talked about originally. And we've had the delay to the budget again, which I think we were hoping was going to provide some of the funding that people have talking about today. And the devolution white paper is you know, potentially up in the air as to when that might appear as well. And so, you know, all these delays, which may be understandable given what's happening with the pandemic, certainly aren't helping achieve the sorts of levelling up ambitions that the government had when they were elected last year. I think the second point for me, and this does come into play with what our business is involved in, is that we absolutely need to see levelling up come hand in hand with devolution and the powers that places need to make decisions for themselves. You know, we know with our client base that, you know, clients, you know where they want to invest and which authorities they want to invest with because of the culture and the way that certain cities and authorities work. So I think, you know, giving places the powers to have more of a say in terms of what happens with the built environment in their infrastructure is undoubtedly going to be helpful in my view. And then the third thing I want to say is that, you know, infrastructure investment requires certainty from a policy perspective and from a funding perspective. And I think, you know, we aren't having that certainty at all at the moment. And, you know, we've got the planning reforms that have been announced that have had a lot of resistance from local authorities across the country in terms of the potential to take away democratic controls through the planning process, as opposed to bring them further to the people that are making those decisions. And so I think, you know, I do question whether fundamental planning reform on the back of a global pandemic is the way to achieve the investment in the built environment that we need to help this levelling up agenda.
Thanks, Kevin. If I can just go back to Andy, I'm particularly interested in, you use the term intelligence and basically having, I suppose, intelligent infrastructure. How do you think that this sector should be engaging with, policymakers, politicians like yourself and Steve, in order to make sure that we actually get what's needed? And do you think that the industry actually engages enough on some of those issues?
They do. I mean, I think Steve would say the same. You know, we get lots of good approaches, and there's a lot of positive engagement. But I think if I look at industry, and if I look at property, I kind of still feel it's in a bit of a rut. You know, it likes to do what it likes to do, build one building in one place, whereas it doesn't sort of think about placemaking. You know, it's got a very traditional way of operating. Same with transport. And I think what we need is transformation in the north, basically. So we need almost consortia of housing, transport, energy organisations to come to us with a bigger vision amongst themselves. I mean, it's really good actually to get the approach from Electricity Northwest and Cadence saying, look, we're ready to work together on 2038. That, Andy, is what I want. And I'm sure Steve's the same. You know, when we've set out a big stall, we want people saying, look, and we can help you get there. And it's actually, that doesn't happen so much. People come and sell us their things, but they don't always come and say, right, we hear what you're saying and here's how we can. And that, so I'd like to see a little more of that, if that makes sense. And, you know, it's about visions for places. You know, levelling up's got to be about not just the cities, but the towns, you know. So I want people to come to me and say, right, you know, you've got a mayoral development corporation in Stockport, which we have, which is the first of its kind in the country on a town. I want infrastructure companies to come together and say, right, we're going to work, we could be a partnership here to work with you on this. And this is what we could put into it. And it's almost kind of going beyond your own comfort zone as a sort of sector and thinking about places as opposed to just the things that you normally do. So they do engage, but I think the quality of the engagement could be more intelligent, to come back to that word.
Thanks, Andy. Just turning to you, Steve. I mean, I think that concept of placemaking is absolutely critical, and I think it's even more critical post COVID. When we get post COVID, going forward. But I was interested in what you said, Steve, about the desire to do something around tidal, because obviously government had that opportunity in Wales and ditched it, and how do we get government to actually listen and act? And is it the case, as Andy's just pointed out, that maybe we need to be working more in partnership with some of these infrastructure organisations to actually come together for the common good? I mean, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, are government listening to you on that and other issues at the minute?
Well, anything that I say is predicated that it's not a criticism of Swansea Bay or of Cardiff, because I don't know enough detail of what those proposals were really to say it was a good or a bad scheme. But the real difficulty in all this, and it was touched upon very briefly by Andy, but just to tease this out as a point, is that we have to go into belt and braces type planning with government because of the Green Book methodology. So central governments say you have to do certain things and you have to comply with certain things, which here are much more difficult than at times down south. And I'll give you an example. So the Silver Jubilee line, the business cost ratio for that, the BCR, meant that scheme shouldn't have went ahead. But everybody knew that you would get uplift land value and other things, you get regeneration if that was to be built. For the Mersey Tidal project, we have to prove our case in a 35-year window. So the economics of this have to be proven within a very short space of time, when we all know that there are going to be 85 years beyond that when energy will still be generated at no real additional cost because the infrastructure will be built. And so that is a disparity between North and South. And I noticed somebody on the chat said, this myth about North and South, I'm sorry, if you live here and work here and try to get infrastructure here, it's very real. And we have to go further, I believe, than our colleagues down South to get a business cost, a benefit cost ratio in our business case that actually attracts government to support infrastructure here and not down there. And it's because of a whole host of things. For instance, they don't include in our project things like the innovation side of this, because no one's doing it. So we could develop it. And what I want to do is work with the likes of Panellists, for instance, to modularize it. And then we could export this technology. I want to develop the skills around this, because Andy's right. It's not just place-based. It has to be people as well and skills. So I want to do that. I want to improve UK PLC's export by doing this. There's a whole host of things we can do. And if we did build it, and if it was to be a barrier, the regeneration of those two areas would be massive, and yet they can't be included in the BCR. So I think it's a game that's skewed against big infrastructure projects here when the South can more readily prove their case.
Just turn to Debbie for a second. Debbie, I mean, you're obviously working closely with, on a number of schemes and projects. I mean, what's your thought on some of those hoops that Steve's just outlined there? I mean, obviously you pick up the commission, you do the work, but is there a sense from your perspective, and I know that you have a keen interest and involvement in the Greater North, that some of the points that Steve has mentioned are real live issues that need addressing?
Yeah, it absolutely does. The Green Book problem has been a problem for a while, and interestingly, in more recent history, classic examples like the amount of hoops that HS2 has had to jump through versus Crossrail, and also the fact, for example, that actually in regards to HS2, the BCR was stronger in the north than it was in the south, which means why on earth did you not start building it in the north? Because if we started building it here, I'm fairly certain it would have gone all the way to London, because they wouldn't have decided to stop it halfway. So there are still those total inconsistencies in what it takes to make the case. And again, that goes back to why the devolution agenda was sensible in the round, because those decisions, as an area and as a region, we can stand and fall by our own decisions, which is absolutely fine. But we can't, while we have to, and Steve mentioned it, I think the amount of effort involved in continually going back, and interestingly, the amount of cost involved in those things that automatically reduces what there is to be spent. And, even on, the placemaking that's been talked about, if you look back at the investment and the amount that comes off placemaking, that is really difficult to assess in the cases. I think London King's Cross brought in 2.2 billion of private investment following the work that happened in King's Cross. So the amount of placemaking and community placemaking that goes on around these large schemes is really hard to put together for that business case, but everybody knows that it's there. And the minute you get a bigger geographic spread, the actual calculations don't work very well. They need to have a different approach to it, without a doubt.
I just want to come back to Andy, because I know Andy's got to leave us shortly. I just want to ask you a question, Andy, about the transport issue, which has been an ongoing cause of concern, I think, across the northern region. And as someone who I spent 20 years in London, and there is and then moved back up north. There's obviously a difference between transport in the south and in the north. But this whole east-west rail, the so-called Northern Powerhouse rail, and other improvements to the rail line in the north, which we've not really seen yet. I mean, what's your thoughts on that? Is there a sense of frustration that that's not happening quick enough?
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with what Debbie said, every word. You know, it should have started with an east-west line across the north, to be honest, because that's the biggest need for transport improvement. You know, a line from Liverpool right through Manchester, Leeds, and then on to Hull to connect the two ports of the north, but then up to the northeast as well. I mean, that's what should have been built, because that's the biggest transport need, I would say, in our country. But then HS2 coming beyond it. You know, someone in the chat is saying, you know, Andy says he wants TfL style transport, but they're in debt. I think people need to, you know, I think picking up what Steve was saying before, you know, some of the comments that we're all, you know, big chips on our shoulder. We probably do have chips on our shoulder, but they're there for a good reason. You know, TfL has had massive subsidy over decades. We don't have that. The person is asking me, could we have transport that's sustainable? Well, Metrolink doesn't get our tram system does not get a public subsidy. We have to finance it ourselves. So we've learned how to make our transport sustainable. You know, the bus system runs on a very small public subsidy, but the consequences are that it's a fragmented, expensive system. And I don't think it's too much for us to ask that we want a system that allows us to integrate the modes and has a cap on what people can spend every day. And actually, we should be subsidizing public transport if we're going to meet our green ambitions. And that will actually be good from a productivity point of view, because it will connect people to jobs and opportunity, get people out of their cars. Cities like Manchester are really held back by congestion and the time it can take to get around. So, you know, we're not saying we're going to get the full London deal, but give us the ability to regulate and fund our transport in the same way, so that, you know, it's easy and efficient and reliable and critically affordable. And yes, then bring in Northern Powerhouse Rail later. But the point I was making, Andy, don't make us sort of choose between which one do you want, HS2 or Northern Powerhouse Rail, or Northern Powerhouse Rail or London style transport now. I would say you need all of these things, because London has got all of these things. Every single train station in London, as far as I can see, has had hundreds of millions, if not billions, spent on them in the last 20 years. We are in a position where we're still arguing with the government about Manchester Piccadilly. They want to build a station at Manchester Piccadilly where, to save costs, they want to do it all on the surface. So they want to do HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail all on the surface. And they want to make Northern Powerhouse Rail a sort of turn-back service where you go in and then you come out the same way. And this is, just to finish on this point, that, in my view, is not intelligent infrastructure. It's cheap infrastructure, but it's not intelligent infrastructure. Intelligent infrastructure would be to build what we're calling for, which is a German style or a continental style layered station at Manchester Piccadilly that then preserves the land around for really high value development. And I would put it to you that, you know, if we did that, Piccadilly would become the sort of, you know, the kind of focal point of the north. I mean, with respect to everyone else on the call, I'm making my pitch, but it would be, you know, an amazing sort of kind of heart of the north. And yet, to pick up what Steve was saying, by forcing us into these BCRs, what they say is, oh, well, we can build it all on the level and we can take away all of your land that you want for development, but we're going to just take that for a train station because we can, and because the Treasury is basically forcing us to do it. And this is the problem. You have to invest on a different case in the north, a long-term, patient, economic and social case for investment. And the risk for the north is we leave Europe. Well, Europe were the only ones who made the social case for investment. The Treasury's only done the economic side of it. So if you're gonna kind of not widen the north-south divide here, we need to embody some of the principles that govern European funding and have a test that is both economic and social. And I would say you invest heavily in places like Manchester Piccadilly to then create that economic opportunity around it for the rest of this century. And instead, sometimes we're forced to do the wrong thing because of the short-termism that continues to affect British business, but also British politics.
Thanks, Andy. I know you've got to leave us now, but thanks for those comments. And there are comments that we actually want to explore a little bit more in terms of how do we ensure that we are making intelligent decisions. And if we can play a small role here at Infrastructure Intelligence in doing that, we'd really welcome the opportunity to do it. So I'll definitely get in touch with yourself and your office just to sort of, hopefully we can surface those issues even
well, thanks,
more.
Andy, for having us. Anyway, exactly the conversation we need to be having right now. So great contributions to all the panelists and good questions coming in. So thanks very much, and let's carry on that conversation.
Well, thanks very much, Andy, for that. And we're going to continue the conversation. And I know that Andy talked about Piccadilly Station, but I know there's grand plans for Middlesbrough Station. Actually, I've seen the pictures. It might not be as grand as Piccadilly, but I know Jesse wanted to come in possibly on this on these questions of transport and other related issues. Jesse, Joe.
Yeah, and you know, the economic impact and the social impact, you can't separate them. And as a living example, just this week I was at a local business who couldn't take on an apprentice because the apprentice couldn't get to his business, and we see case after case. We have whole towns and villages that aren't even connected by bus, and so if we want to see levelling up at a regional level, we need to ensure that we don't leave those communities behind by having such poor transport infrastructure. We desperately want to see the upgrading of the East Coast main line, and you know, that would be a game changer for our ability. It still takes an hour and 10 minutes to take a train journey that is quicker by car or by bus at the moment. It is, you know, I feel like after so many years, I don't know how we're still having to have this argument and this fight. It just feels so unjust, and it's unjust for the people in these regions that could get on. We could be able to have people who work in Manchester, who work in Leeds, who work in Newcastle, if we could reduce that commuter time. And that in itself will increase the prosperity of the Northeast.
Thanks, Jessica. I just want to bring Henry in to explore a couple of issues. It's clearly the case, you know, that we need economic growth to actually, and you know, it's all well and good talking about economic growth, but people have got to benefit from that and to be seen to benefit from that. I mean, how are you getting to grips with that in your area? I know you have maybe some, you know, different powers that that Andy and Steve's mayoralty have, but how are you getting to grips with that? I mean, you mentioned things like the the train line up in Northumberland, but you know, how do you see that going forward, and what kind of things are you pushing for to get that investment to make a difference?
So I would say, without wanting to bore you with our entire contents of a recovery plan, which contains many of the elements that we've just talked about, there's a few components of more inclusive growth that I think are completely vital. So we've all talked about social infrastructure in some way, but if you look at the evidence on the performance of cities and places, it's usually the quality of human capital and the infrastructure around that is the biggest determinant. So investment in skills, investment in education, in the join up in areas like work and health, knowing that, you know, if you've got big health inequalities, you're less likely to have more people in work and contributing to economic productivity. Those are really fundamental areas for investment. Every region would say the same. We've all got varying versions of that. In the north of Tyne, we have a year-on-year investment fund that is revenue funding, and therefore gives us, you know, we're not, because we don't have transport powers in the same way Liverpool and Manchester do, for example, or certainly not only for the mayor and combined authority anyway, we are investing in those areas that we're not tied up with 30 years of station refurbs, put it that way. So actually being able to make some early investments in social infrastructure is really important to us. And I think in terms of the vision for transport in future, it's absolutely right that we all need to be pushing as close to TfL style model as possible, because of the fact that that is what will allow us to join up the transport outcomes with the social and economic outcomes of the place. And if you look at the plans that are now coming through, which are region wide, Durham to Northumberland, they all emphasize a joined up integrated transport system with digital connectivity inbuilt in a way that directly supports the economic goals of the place. And we think, and so there's your, unless you can draw a line between them, I think what you end up doing is pushing for the creation of systems that serve today, whereas actually we're talking about 20, 30, 50, 100 years time. And I think that's the join up that we have to create as combined authorities, and that is the virtue. I would say one thing which is about a way of working point, and you would expect me to say this as an official rather than a politician, but we have to find a way of co-producing the future here that feels a little bit less like computer says no. And I think people have various versions of that. The Green Book discussion is another. One of the things mayoral combined authorities do is create strong collaborations. If they're working well, they create a degree of convening between the public sector and the private sector that wasn't previously there. We have developed assurance frameworks. We have ways of working that mean you can share some of that power and decision. Well, I don't think that is a huge risk in the way that it is often framed. You know, this kind of, we do everything via the Treasury centrally versus we devolve everything. I actually think there's a co-productive model that we haven't explored fully enough yet that could get us somewhere down the line. So I think we're set to do more than we currently are, and I would agree with the scale of ambition. And I'd say, you know, if we're going to set up these mayoral combined authorities and regional infrastructure, then let's use it. Let's use it and push it for all that we can push it for, and try and join things up and do infrastructure intelligently.
Thanks very much, Henry. I mean, clearly one of the things that's going to be involved in carrying out this, you know, so-called levelling up is quite significant amounts of finance and money, and obviously, you know, there's been a lot of money spent, particularly around the current, you know, pandemic. But I'm just a question for Kevin Whitmore, really. How do we get across a positive message into every community about the money needed to, you know, to actually redress the balance here in the north, and how do, because often, you know, what some politicians would say, well, of course, you know, cost is an issue. How do we actually get it across that it's actually worth spending that money, and here's what you're going to get for what you put in? How do we get that positive message across from your perspective as someone involved in comms?
I think it's a mixture of you know, clients, applicants themselves being proactive and engaging properly with communities about what they're wanting to do within communities and the benefits that it brings. And it's not just about the sort of socio-economic benefits. Oh, we're going to create a few jobs. We're going to you know, take on a few apprenticeships. It is the whole social value piece. And I think from my perspective, the whole thinking within our clients around social value and what that really means, not just for you know, as I say, for those socio-economic sort of numbers, but also actually what are the long-term benefits of this investment in that community over the lifetime of a project, I think is really becoming central to thinking and communicating positively about investment that's happening. I think the other thing as well is you know, Andy talks about it, is about the private sector engaging with local authorities, with city regions, about the need for this type of investment more generally, not just on a red line boundary and what do I want to do with my site. And I think we've seen campaigns recently, whether it was a few years ago, the campaign to make sure that HS2 did come all the way up north rather than just stopping in Birmingham, or whether a campaign that's going on at the minute around the standard housing methodology, which potentially could limit the number of homes that will get built in the north as a result of the planning reforms. I think there is, you know, a desire from across business and from across the region to be able to come together with one voice. And I think things like the Northern Powerhouse Partnership that Dev is involved in have been key in giving people the confidence to do that and to have something, to have a vehicle to give that voice to central government as well.
Thanks very much for that. Marcus, I just want to bring you in. One of the things that we're waiting for many things as a result of the pandemic, and that is the government's much vaunted and much awaited recovery and devolution white paper in the autumn, which, you know, potentially is going to set out plans for further devolved powers, further combined authorities and elected mayors. I mean, how do you see that developing? You know, and what are you expecting from that? And if you can keep it brief, because I want to get back to Debbie and also Jessie Joe before we finish. But, you know, is that going to look differently as a result of COVID? Presumably it is. You know, what can we expect from that?
It's a good question if it will look differently. I mean, you know, we've been waiting for this for 2 years, and what we started to see, I think, was quite disappointing. The government choosing to wrap up the devolution of powers to quite contentious local government reorganisation. That doesn't seem to be responsive to COVID. You know, local authorities have really been at the wheel in terms of responding to COVID and to sort of, you know, local pressures and trying to roll out their own track and trace and all of this stuff. And then at the same time, the government says we're going to give you extra powers whilst abolishing a whole bunch of district councils. I think was quite disappointing and doesn't seem to marry up with reality. So we are hoping that the delay, whilst disappointing, does lead to further discussion and a revisiting of the principles, because it needs to be about pushing power down into local communities and not about pulling it upwards for us, really.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Marcus. Just turning to you, Debbie, and looking at our industry, and I suppose working with the opinion formers, the decision makers. You know, Andy kind of made a sort of an appeal really for the infrastructure sector to get more involved and to actually help elected politicians get to a position where they make the decisions that are needed. You know, how can we do that as an industry, and what more can we do? I know you're involved on a number of different bodies in doing some of that, but how can we do that, do you think, as an industry across the board? And I'll come to Kevin in a second as well. But
yep, can you hear me? Sorry, you've frozen. Yeah, I think, you know, I think lots of industry are already involved in some of this. You know, ourselves, for example, are involved in all sorts of in bodies and trying to help support industry, not just in figuring out, to help support local government and authorities, not just in figuring out where to get funding, but how to bring those partnerships together. I mean, you know, interestingly, Arcadis have got, just as a thing, they're launching, and they've been doing a significant piece of work over the last couple of months, a piece of research about the whole recovery and what that might need to look like and what the latest situation is going to mean to everybody's agenda, because it's changed, hasn't it? But how much has it changed? It's one of the questions we've been asking. So there's a piece of thought leadership being published next week called A Shared Recovery, Solutions for Stronger Communities, that really has pulled together a huge piece of research looking at what would be needed and how but industry and local government come together and what they should be thinking about in order to make these stronger and wealthier communities that we mentioned. That's being published next week. I was having a read through it yesterday, and it really does begin to give those ideas about what we can do. And I think there's plenty of people out in the industry who are obviously, you know, are happy to come to the table to try to support it for, you know, a whole plethora of reasons, not just, you know, obviously their own personal ones. I think, you know, I know from Arcadis' point of view, and there's other people in the marketplace who think the same way, that this looking for the benefit of the future of good for everybody works for everybody. So it isn't, you know, purely down to what you want as a company. So I think local authorities just need to, local governments, combined authorities and central government just need to keep engaging with the private industry. We have the ideas, there's plenty of money going into investment and thought leadership around it. And so they need to keep speaking with us.
Thanks, Debbie. Just turning to Kevin, and it's a kind of a sort of a post-COVID sort of question, really, and I think it might well help us, you know, sort of neatly tie things together and possibly to start to conclude. And that is one of the things that people were talking about earlier was the thing about transport investment, and one of the issues that's been used to justify that is linking it up with, you know, what you call land value capture, the value of the land adjacent to transport development. Now, obviously, post-COVID, some of the value of that land is actually going to go down. So is that model viable going forward? Because I know that particularly in London, that's obviously been a driver for some of the investment, and it's a point that's been raised in the chat as well by I think Peter from Manchester. I think, you know, is that something that's viable going forward, or do we need to look at things differently? And also, sort of flowing from that, how will infrastructure look post-COVID? You know, what lessons do we need to learn as a result of this pandemic? If you can kick off on that, Kevin.
Well, in terms of the lessons, I think certainly for my business and the way that we go about it, you know, the way that we're doing all this now, digital connectivity, digital engagement, I think has absolutely come to the fore. You know, a lot of the community engagement that we deliver for infrastructure investments coming forward is now being done with these sorts of platforms in a way that if you'd have told me in January we would have been doing that, I would have really shook my head and thought you were living on a different planet. So, you know, the digitization of the planning process and on community engagement has absolutely accelerated. And I think that is forever going to continue. The genie is out of the bottle from that perspective. And of course, that means that we are all using transport less. You know, I think I have no intention of going back to the office 5 days a week when the pandemic is over. If I don't need to, I'm enjoying the balance of a bit of working from home and with hopefully some interaction in the office as well. So that is going to have an impact. But I do think, you know, it's something we touched on before the webinar started. You know, I am missing face-to-face interaction with colleagues and with collaborators. So I think let's not underestimate that need for people to be together in the same space in city centres. I think that will come back. Whether it has an impact on land values and the delivery of infrastructure, I think there's probably others that are better to comment on that than the communications consultant, Andy.
Okay, thanks for that, Kevin. Henry, in a post-COVID world, what do you think we need to learn in terms of, you know, the infrastructure sector, in terms of the type of infrastructure that we might need going forward?
Well, I would echo Kevin's questioning of whether we're anywhere near a post-COVID world and say probably a bit of due humility is needed. We certainly, like everywhere, went into this with an immediate set of necessary responses and then a bit of thinking about recovery. And now we're back in the stage where the two things are absolutely mixed. And so the you know, who would have thought that even a month ago would be back to thinking about reductions of footfall on the transport network, approaching the scale that we were in the early stages of this in March and April. So I think we've got it's a bit like Gandhi's comment about Western civilization, isn't it? It's too early to tell. So some of that, a bit of due humility. I do think there are a couple of things though that we know will need to feel different, and our infrastructure requirements and the way we shape our investment strategies need to follow. The urban-rural mix for us is a big deal, and if Kevin's right that we're talking about different patterns of work and commuting, living, which are not necessarily about dense city centres and lots of people within office buildings being the model of inward investment, then that has a meaning, doesn't it? That has a meaning for the shape of our inward investment activities, and it also has a meaning for obviously for the construction sector and the way we think about the enabling infrastructure. I think in a part of the world like ours, we have a city, Newcastle, that is a breathable city. It's a city that can do well out of that mix of needing good health infrastructure and clean spaces and clean air, and, you know, the ability to mix those things. And so that's going to be a huge part of the way we think about infrastructure, including the housing component from here on in. And then an obvious point that Kevin's already made as well, but we, you know, digital isn't just sort of sticks and masts and a 5G pilot and full fibre. It's about your mindset. It's about how you think about what you deliver and how your services work. And I think we are still in the early stages really of working through, well, what does this mean? What's the order of not only digital connectivity, but digital services that we're going to need in future? And I think those things, the interaction between those things is going to define the future for infrastructure in our places, in my view.
Thanks for that, Henry. Marcus, I mean, again, underlining what Henry's just said, you know, we didn't think that we'd be back in the situation that that we're in, but we, at the same time, we do kind of need to try and look forward. I mean, how do you view things in terms of making sure that the North gets the infrastructure that it needs through this and also post this? Are the structures fit for purpose?
Well, I suppose it's been slightly disrupted with the government announcing it was the Northern Economic Delivery Council, whatever they've called it, that sort of is going to deliver the stuff that TFN have come up with. And I think that's maybe slightly confused matters, is that we had structures, and then in the middle of the pandemic, the government kind of came out and criticised them slightly. So I think really, you know, for us, we want to be getting behind TFN, building up their capacity, making sure that we have a list of projects, because I think there is a danger of government delivering Northern Powerhouse Rail and then kind of seeing Northern Transport as done and moving on to whatever the next, you know, big thing is. And that ultimately for us, levelling up has really got to be that whole swathe of things we talked about. But when it comes to transport, all of the small things, the powers to deliver all of the things that, you know, our mayors want to deliver and that councils want to deliver. I think just in terms of COVID, and, you know, never before has there been a moment, maybe when cars rolled out, you know, rolled out for the first time, but where transport behaviour has changed so quickly and so much. And as people have started coming back onto transport, we've seen, I saw some data around kind of confidence levels in public transport, and the people who had been on public transport had seen their confidence decline, having seen, you know, other passengers' behaviour, not wearing masks and things. And we really have to do two things, I think. One is to continue making the case for infrastructure investment, but the second is we've got a really big job in terms of building confidence back in public transport. And if we don't do that, we will see a massive shift towards back towards people driving everywhere, which goes against all of the things that we've talked about today. So I think we can't just assume that there's a discussion about infrastructure. There has to be a discussion about confidence behaviour. Now, really, we need to be doing that already.
Thanks very much, Marcus. Jesse, Joe, your some final thoughts from you before I bring Debbie in to make some concluding remarks. Jesse, Joe.
Yeah, just to summarise, really, we do need visions for the future, and it's never been so important that we have that placemaking and that forward thinking from a regional level. The world has changed, COVID has changed it, and a lot of it won't go back. I'm convinced of that we won't go back to crammed office spaces in city centres. So we will have to change, infrastructure will have to change, and as someone who will potentially be representing a place that has urban centres and rural, the importance of local, the importance of neighbourhoods, but also how do we facilitate co-work space at a neighbourhood level? How do we facilitate the much less time spent on public transport, but also bringing in the green economy to not go back to car use means that cycleways are going to be at the top of the agenda. But most importantly, the ability to move quickly. We saw during the COVID crisis that we can build hospitals in a week. We can do it. We can see innovation funds put online within weeks. Innovation funds that I thought would take years to see come alive, came online within weeks around digital and technology. We need that same speed of the government to give these funds and to make decisions. We can't keep waiting for years for big infrastructure decision making to happen. We need speed because we need to prepare for the next big crisis, which is the climate crisis.
Thanks very much, Jesse, Joe, for that. And just to finish off, Debbie, your thoughts on you know, how things might change, and also the role that this sector needs to play within that going forward.
Okay, so yeah, I think Andy said it before, very hard to say exactly how it will change. You know, we've done a piece of research that shows the types of things and the levers that are going to be required for the shared recovery, but we're also not at that recovery point yet. We're kind of, you know, we've taken a step backwards. So I think, you know, a lot of what I've read about what those levers are really valid, but also I'm looking at that, you know, a lot of the chat and a lot of the constant sort of questioning that we see a lot of about should we be doing this and should we be doing that and should we be doing the other. And I've sort of said once before in an event I was at, and I'd say it again, I think we need to also stop second guessing ourselves continually. I think at the end of the day, we've got to remember that we are not, and I have said this before, we are not taking millions of pounds out of our wallet and setting fire to it. When we undertake these projects, that money is going back into the community. It's going back into the skills, which in turn supports education, which in turn supports better health and well-being. And a huge piece of it comes back into the economy. We're not throwing it away. So I think to some extent, we need to consider that we've got to stop second guessing all this. This country has quite genuinely, over hundreds of years, underestimated its infrastructure requirements. As we sit here today, it's really hard to say, will we ever get back to the rail the way it was? Will we ever get back to this? Will we ever get back to that? But you know what? We can't look into the future to that extent. So it's time to just make sure that we rock on with the projects that need to be done and that we can see the reasons for today, and don't try and second guess every single thing that's coming in the future. Get on with it, accept that that puts an economy back that has a potential to help us grow and expand, and that will be good for everybody at the end of the day.
Thanks very much for that, Debbie. We've run out of time, as we always do, because time is a finite concept. I just want to thank everybody for their time today, to Steve Rotheram, from the Mayor of Liverpool City Region, Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham, who obviously had to leave us early, but really appreciative of their input during the course of today's roundtable. To Dr. Henry Kippin from the north of Tyne Combined Authority. Thank you very much, Henry, for your contributions. To Marcus Johns from IPPR North, and for those that aren't familiar with IPPR's North's work, check out their website. Loads of interesting stuff on there, particularly on this very relevant issue that we've been discussing today. Thanks to Debbie from Arcadis, to Jessie Jo Jacobs, the Labour's candidate for the Tees Valley Mayor. Good luck next year. Good luck to all the candidates, of course, next year. We have to be scrupulous, impartial on infrastructure intelligence. And thanks very much to Kevin Whitmore from BECG, and big thanks to BECG for their support for our Infrastructure Intelligence Live series of events, which continues next week with what I'm sure will be a fascinating and interesting discussion on delivering a green recovery. The issue of net zero and the environment was mentioned repeatedly today, and I think it's really important that we discuss those issues going forward as well. Just to kind of wrap things up for today, I think it's been a really good discussion. I think there's clearly a lot more to discuss about the politics of devolution, about the role of infrastructure in engaging with the political process, and that's something that we are very, very keen to do here at Infrastructure Intelligence as we go forward, because there's no question that infrastructure investment will make a massive difference to society going forward. But I think as well, one thing that's come through loud and clear for me today, and it was raised by all of our speakers, and that is the difference that infrastructure investment can make. The social value of infrastructure investment, I think, is extremely important, and one which our sector really needs to highlight on a regular basis. Thanks to our audience for being online, and we hope to see you again at an infrastructure intelligence event very, very soon. Hopefully next Friday at the same time, same place, 11 a.m. But for now, it's bye-bye from everyone. Bye-bye and see you soon. Thanks very much indeed to everybody. Thank you.